Hey everyone, so I'm gonna just do a really simple programming challenge today. I'm gonna basically just create a very simple program that adds two numbers together and then outputs them to the console. And I'm gonna do it using a function. So we'll learn kind of how to construct really basic functions today. I'm using Visual Studio as my IDE, and I'm just gonna build a super simple console app. If you need to, you can search over here for console application, and I would almost always use just the .NET framework console app. And you can select what framework you want to use. I'm going to be using 4.8, so I'd suggest you use the same thing. And we'll go ahead and call this sum of two numbers, since that's the function that we're going to write, and that's what it's going to do. So we can go ahead and click create. It'll create our little main method for us. So don't worry too much about what all of this means. Just focus on kind of our main method here. Main is going to be our entry point of our program. So when our program, if we decide to compile it to be an executable, this is going to be the first method that gets hit. This is going to be what actually runs, and we can kind of test that by, let me go ahead and let me just declare just a super simple variable. So just var test equals 0, and we'll go ahead and set a breakpoint here. If we click start, it should break right here with that little yellow symbol there. We can see that we're actually inside of our program right now. If I press F10, we can see down here in our locals that we have a variable named test that is set equal to 0 of type int, but that's not super relevant to what we're actually going to be doing, just kind of illustrating what main is. So let's go ahead and comment what kind of our objective is. So if you want to write comments in C#, it's 2 forward slashes. And our objective is to write a function that takes two numbers and adds them together and then returns the value. Probably a more eloquent way of writing that without that many commas, but that's kind of what we're going to be doing today. So let's go ahead and get started. So to create a new function, since we're going to be calling it from our main function, main happens to be a static method. And with static methods, you can only call other static members or methods inside of that class. So we have our program class, and we have our static method inside of this class. And so if we decide to write this method that's going to take two numbers, then we have to make sure it's a static method. So we'll write the keyword static. So after we write that keyword static, what we have to do is we have to define a return type. And since we want to return a number, we have to decide what kind of number we want to return. You have to decide if you want to be a floating point number. Are we going to have a method that multiplies two floating points together? Are we going to have a method that returns a double, which is just basically twice the capacity of a float as far as being stored in memory? So it's also a floating point number. It just can be more precise. Or do we want to return integers? Whatever number type we want to return. So let's go with something simple. Let's just go with an int for now, which is short for integer, so whole numbers. We're writing a method that returns the sum of two whole numbers. And we'll go ahead and call it something descriptive. So we'll call it sum int. And then we'll add parentheses, which we'll put our parameters in just a second. And then we'll add a body of the function, which will execute whenever this method gets called. And notice that this method has got a red squiggly under it, and it'll tell you program.sumInt, not all code paths return a value, and it's unused. So we haven't called this, and also we haven't returned an integer from this method yet. So first, let's define what parameters we're going to take. And parameters is just a fancy word for saying what kind of, I guess, ingredients in our recipe are we going to pass into this method to, bake our cake, so to speak. So what do we want to put in to get our result? And we want to take two numbers, right? So, and we're going to be returning an integer. So let's pass in two integers as well. So int, we'll say num1, and then int num2. And so what we're going to do inside of the body of the method is just add these two together and then return it. So to make it super clear, I'll say int number to return. and I'll set it equal to num1 plus num2. And then I'll end it with a semicolon, because you got to end everything in C# with a semicolon. And then I will return number to return. Let's go over kind of what I just did here. So I'm creating a new variable inside of the method, and I'm setting it equal to num1, our first parameter, plus num2, which is our second parameter. And then I'm returning the result of that. So I'm returning number to return to whatever calls this. And we don't have anything that calls it right now. If we highlight this again, it'll say private member program.sumInt is unused. We're not using this method anywhere. So let's change that. Let's go into our main function, since this is getting called from, this is the entry point of our program. So we should call our sumInt function from here. And let's go ahead and get sumInt, and let's pass in 0 and 3. Actually, a better example would probably be like 2 and 3. Let's go ahead and do that. But when we actually run this, we're not going to see anything in the console. So if I click start, I clicked over here on line 15 just to set a breakpoint here so it'll stop. If we go ahead and press F10, it'll say down here inside of our locals kind of menu down here, it'll say sum of two numbers dot program dot sumInt returned 5, which is good. It means that I added 2 and 3 together. In fact, let me restart this and stop at that breakpoint. And I'll press F11 to go into this function. And we can see that num1, the value of num1 right here is 2, which correlates to the number that we sent in here inside of our main function. And then the value of num2 is 3, which also correlates to the value that we have here inside of our main function. So if I go ahead and press F10, we can see the values down here inside of the locals, which locals just refers to the local values inside of whatever method you're in currently. So then if I press F10, we can see that the value inside of number to return is 5, which means that it successfully added our two numbers, which is awesome. And so we'll go ahead and return, which will take us back to our main method. And then if I press F10, the program will exit, and that's it. So we know that it added it together, but it didn't show it to us. So the user that's using this function doesn't know that numbers have been added together. So let's go ahead and change that. So there's a method inside of the .NET framework, inside of the console class, which is contained inside of the system namespace. So if I write console.writeLine, and then we actually put, just to be abundantly clear, let's go ahead and write, well, let's declare a new variable, and let me remove that red because it's probably getting confusing. So if I write int my summed num is equal to, and then we'll go ahead and cut this from up here and paste it here, then we can pass in my summed num into console.writeLine, and we can output it to the user. So let's go ahead and click on that breakpoint there. Click start. We can see that it stopped on line 17. I'll bring up my terminal really quick and actually kind of make this cleaner. And then as soon as I step over this by pressing F10, alternatively I can press step over up here. If I press F10, boom, it wrote our 5 to the console, so the user knows that 2 and 3 were added together, which is kind of cool. So that's our super simple sumInt function that we've written there. So let's switch this up a little bit to make it a little bit more efficient, because this works, but we could probably make our code a little bit more concise and a little bit more readable. So let's start with our function that we wrote down here. So it's called sumInt, which is fine, but we can actually kind of reduce the amount of wordage that we have going on down here. So instead of having int number to return equals num1 plus num2 and then returning number to return, then that's a little wordy. I kind of wrote it this way just to make it more comprehensible. We can actually make it a little bit more efficient here. So instead of returning just number to return, we can actually just return num1 plus num2 right here. And even more so, we can use something called a lambda expression, which might seem scary at first, but a lambda expression basically just means with as far as a method goes is I just want to do something in one line. If it's something that's longer than one line, if it's a method that requires more than just one line of code, then you don't typically want to use lambda expressions. They can get pretty messy. So if we use something called a lambda expression, which is what this little sort of over arrow is, and we remove these brackets and then return this up here, then it'll just return num1 plus num2 right here inside of this lambda expression. So what this lambda expression is saying is basically identical to what we just had. It's just a little bit more readable and a lot more concise, so it doesn't take up 4 lines inside of your program. It just takes up 1. It doesn't make the program any faster necessarily, it just makes it look cleaner. So that's that. And let's go ahead and verify that that actually works. So if I click start and we kind of move our terminal over there again and step through this, if I press F10, then boom, we've got a 5 instead of our mySumToNum variable. And then if I press F10 again, boom, there's our 5 to the console. So it works identically to our program before, just it's a little bit cleaner. And then let's make this a little bit more interactive with the user. So this actually haven't done in a minute, so this might be some learning on the fly for me. But we actually want to get our 2 numbers from the user and then output them to the user, and then we'll be done with our little program here. So I'm going to write console.readKey, and the reason I'm doing that, let me kind of show what happens without console.readKey, and I don't have any breakpoints. If I just press start, it'll run the program super quickly, and it doesn't stop to actually show us what happened. So it'll run our little SumInt function, it'll write it to the console, and then it will close the program. So we're going to put console.readKey here to basically say, hey, stop at the very end of the program. Don't progress until I press a key on the keyboard. So now if I press start, it'll pause, and it'll show us our little 5 up there, which is great. We've got our nice little 5. So that's why I put that console.readKey method there. So this readKey method is also a part of the console class, and it will just stop the program from ending. So that's why we're putting that there. Okay, so let's get our input from the user. So let's get, we'll call it number1. So int num1 is equal to console.readKey. Or let's go with readLine. And we're going to use a method called int.parse to read this line from the user. So let me kind of explain what's going on here. So let me comment out mySumToNum. So what we're doing here is we're basically asking the user to write something into the console. So that's what this readLine method is basically doing, is prompting the user to put something into the console. And then we're going to parse it, meaning we're going to convert it to be of type integer. Whatever they put in, we'll convert it to be this type over here. And so that's a part of our int type or int class, or I guess it's a struct in this case. So that's what this line is kind of doing. And so we're going to actually do that twice. So num1 is going to be this, and then num2 is going to be this. And then on this line, on this third line down here, instead of passing in just 2 and 3 explicitly, we're going to pass in num1 and then num2 as our input from our users. And then we'll write that to the console instead, which makes it a lot more interesting and a lot more functional as far as the user is concerned. So if we press start, it's going to be blank, but if I write 10 and press enter, and then press 10 again and then press enter, it'll output 20, which is awesome. That's cool. The problem is it's not very user-friendly. Like, I was met with a blank screen, right? So it's just like this pit of blackness that doesn't actually mean anything to me. It's not prompting me, asking me to put in any numbers. It's not doing any of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to prompt the user. So I'm going to say console.writeLine please enter in your first number. Let me kind of explain what I'm doing here. So this kind of orangey, salmonish colored text is something called a string, which you can see right there. It says class system.string represents text as a sequence of UTF, blah, 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 blah. Basically, it's just a bunch of characters that you can output to the console in this case. So it's just, think of it as a bunch of characters and words strung together. It's all a string is. It's a string of characters. It's just text. That's all a string is. And so what this will do is it'll actually write that to the console. So it'll kind of prompt our user to put in their first number. And then you can probably guess what we're going to do right after we put in our first number. We're going to prompt them to put in their second number. And now if we run our program, I'll say, please enter in your first number. So I'll enter in 6. Please enter in your second number, and I'll enter 90. And boom, 96. It added those two together. So our program now accepts user input, which is super cool. Then if I press enter, it'll close our program. Cool. Yay. So that works, but we have a problem. If I press start and I decide to write something that's not a number, boom, our program crashed. It threw an exception. So it says input string was not in a correct format because we tried to parse a number from whatever I wrote in there, the FASDA. So that broke. So let's do some error checking to make this more efficient. We're going to actually have to use something called a loop to kind of basically run this until we get a valid input. So we're going to do something called try parse instead. So int num1 equals int.tryparse console.readline and out int result. So we'll put int num1, and we'll put num1 inside of here, and we'll have to close this. And we'll set this bool did parse first num is equal to int.tryparse. We'll set num1 equal to 0 up here. That's why this is complaining. Or maybe that's not why. Oh, I know why. We need to pass the keyword out. So let me kind of explain what's going on here, because I just did a lot all at once. So right here, I basically redeclared my variable num1. And instead of having it read directly from this readline method, right now this is just empty. It'll actually have a default value of 0, because that's just how C# works. And so I just declared it. I didn't define it. So those are some important words to kind of understand in C# or just programming in general. Define and declare. So declaring is just naming a variable. So right here I've declared it. Actually assigning it a value is defining it. So this next line is going to define our num1 variable. But let me kind of explain what's going on here. So if I highlight this tryparse method, so notice that I'm using tryparse instead of parse now. If I highlight this tryparse method, it actually gives us some handy little documentation of what it accepts and what it returns. So on the far left of this line here, it says bool, which means that it's going to return a bool value. So I want to set whatever this method tryparse is going to return to. I want to assign that value to a variable, which is what I'm doing here. I'm assigning that value to did parse first num. So a bool value is just a true or false value. So it's just on or off. It did work or it didn't work is kind of what did parse first num is doing here. And so if we go back to highlight this, it accepts a string as its first parameter, and it accepts out int result as its second parameter. So it needs to take an integer as its second parameter with the keyword out in front of it. And so what out is doing is whatever number I pass into this method, whatever integer I pass in this case num1, it will get assigned the value of whatever try-parse. If try-parse succeeds, it will get assigned the value of whatever I typed into our console. Is what this out keyword is doing, is it's passing num1 by reference into this method so that it will get assigned the value of whatever is on our line that we typed in. So that's our line 18. Now what we're going to do is we're going to write something called a while loop. So while, which actually makes me think that maybe we should have done this in a different order, which I'll actually correct now. So we'll set bool did parse first num. We'll actually initially set that to, we'll set that to be equal to false because it has not been parsed yet. So we'll set that to false. And then while did parse first num is equal to false, we will try to set did parse first num. We will try to set it equal to int.tryParse. We'll try to basically set it to true, assuming that this worked out. If it didn't, then we're just going to keep trying over and over again, trying to get input from the user. So let's actually make that explicitly clear to the user. But before I do that, let's go ahead and take care of this error down here. So right now it says use of unassigned local variable num1. So it's getting mad because right now num1 doesn't have a value assigned to it, which means that if we pass num1 if we pass that into some int, then it's gonna throw a null reference exception. So we have to set it equal to something. It may not be nullable. Yeah, it's not nullable. So I'll have to set it to 0 in this case. Or let's actually set it to, let's set it to 0. Just to give our num1 a value so that this will compile correctly. Because ideally, this is going to loop forever. This while loop is going to loop forever until we actually assign a value successfully to our num1 value. So let me kind of explain what this while loop is saying. So this keyword while is basically saying while this condition is true, we're going to execute whatever is inside the body of the loop over and over and over again until this isn't true anymore. So what this is saying is while did parse first num is equal to false, we're going to try and parse our number into this guy. So let's go ahead and see that in action. So if I go ahead and press start and our method pulls up, I'm actually not going to have that breakpoint. I'm just going to let the program kind of do its thing. It's going to ask me, hey, please enter your first number. I'm going to enter in, whatever I want. Or I have a breakpoint, so I'm brain dead. I'll click continue. So I just typed all that, and it's not able to parse any of this, but it's not breaking the program, but it's not continuing the program either. So I can type all this, but we're not going to continue until, I press 10 or whatever. And it says, hey, please enter in your second number. So let's put some output to the user to kind of say, hey, you entered in the number wrong. So if, we're going to use an if statement now. So if did parse first num is equal to false, then we're going to say console.writeLine please enter a valid integer. And then else, meaning that if did parse first num is equal to true, then we're going to write successfully parsed integer value from your input. Boom. There we go. So now let's go ahead and run through this program again. So if I press start, please enter your first number. Blah, 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 blah. Please enter a valid integer. Please enter a valid integer. I can type, whatever I want here. Please enter a valid integer. So now if I type in 90, or let's try 9 space 0, please enter a valid integer. So let's do 55. Successfully parsed integer value from your input. Please enter in your second number. Boom. It works. Awesome. So that's kind of how our while loop works. So let's just go over it one more time. So while this value is equal to false, we're going to loop through everything in here. We're going to loop through it over and over and over again. So did parse first num, we're going to try and assign it whatever try parse, well, we will assign it. Just if this successfully parses whatever we input and assigns it to num1, then it will assign this true. Otherwise, it's going to assign it false. So then on line 24, if it's false, then we're going to output this. If it's true, we're going to output this. And then it will cycle back up to here, check to see if this condition is equal to true or not, and then break out of it. So let's actually step through this a couple times inside of the code just so it makes sense. So I'll set a breakpoint here so that we stop in our tracks, and please enter your first number. So let's step over this and get to here and then step over that. So now it's going to prompt us for whatever. So let's enter in an invalid value. So I'll enter in that. And over here we can see that did parse first num has a value of false currently because we entered in an incorrect value over there. Then if I press F10, it's equal to false. So we'll write this out to the console. You can see it's out in the console over here. If we press F10 again, it'll loop back up here. It'll check to see if did parse first num is equal to false, which it is currently. And we'll step through and we'll try it again. So now it'll ask us to enter in another line, or enter in something valid. So now let's enter in something valid. So let's enter 88. So now we can see that did parse first num is equal to true. So now, since it's not equal to false, it'll go to our second condition, and it'll write to the console successfully parsed integer value. Boom, there it is. Fantastic. Okay. So now it'll go back up to the top of our while loop. And since did parse first num is equal to true, meaning it's not equal to false, it's going to break out of our loop. And it'll go to our next line down here. Boom, there we go. So that's our program, at least thus far. There's still some other stuff that we can do. I just entered in 88 again, and now it's adding them together. 176. But notice that we don't have this validation on our second input. So if I go ahead and press start and get rid of this breakpoint, bring the program back up, please enter your first number, enter in 88, and then I can enter in anything, and it'll throw another exception because we haven't provided this validation for our second input. So let's go ahead and add that validation. So let's do it this way first. So let's have our int num2, set it equal to 0, and then bool did parse second num, and set it equal to false. Then let's copy and paste this. And let's go ahead and copy that and then paste it in here and then put num2 right there. And then let's nuke all this stuff right here. Okay. So all I did was basically do the exact same thing, but we did it twice instead of just once to validate both our numbers, because that's what we need to do here. So now if we run this program, both of our inputs should be valid, or should be, what's the word? Validated. Not valid, but validated. So we press that, it can't parse an integer, so it's screaming at us to put a valid integer in there. So let's put 0, and boom, it successfully parsed it. So now if we write, oh, I forgot to give us a prompt to enter our second number, which we can do here in a second. But when we're writing, it's not able to parse anything. Then if we enter 66, successfully parsed integer value from your input, and it shows us the sum of the two numbers, which is 66, and 0 plus 66 is 66. So let's go ahead and close out of that, and let's prompt our user. So console.writeLine. Let's actually just copy and paste this from up here. Please enter your second number. So this works. This program works currently, but we can make it better. We can make it a lot better. So kind of a red flag when you're writing code, if you're repeating yourself, if you're writing multiple things right after another, it's probably a good idea to write a function. So similar to how we wrote this down here, we need to write a function to parse our integer from our, to parse to parse our integer from the console. So let's go ahead and do that right now. So let's write static int, and we'll just say parse int from console. And let's pass in our integer. Actually, we might not even need to pass in our integer. Let's not pass in our integer. Let's just have parse int from console. I'm kind of thinking about this on the fly, so we'll figure this out. So let's cut our while loop here, and let's put it in here. So it's going to be blinking red a lot because we have a lot of things in here that we don't have defined locally within this method. So let's go ahead and rename these things in here to kind of be more reflective of what we're actually doing. So let's rename this, which is handy. Instead of Visual Studio, you can just right-click any variable name, and then you can start renaming it, and it will rename all of the subsequent references that is used in. So we'll call this parsed num. We'll press enter. And then we'll put just int num is equal to 0 right here. And then out, we'll just put num. Boom. And then at the end, we need to return a value. So that's why this is red right now. It's because it's saying that not all code paths return a value. So we'll just return num. Okay, so now what we can do is we can set int num1 equal to parse int from console. And it will run through this code here and return a value to our num1 variable instead of us having to run this code twice. So let's nuke this code right here as well, and let's just go parse int from console again. And then we'll add those two right here. So we made our main function a lot cleaner. We made it way cleaner here. So you can see that now instead of, all those lines, we just have two super simple lines right here that are parsing ints from console. And we've written our actual logic inside of a separate method called parse int from console. When I say method, it's the same thing as function. I don't know if I said that already, but those terms are used interchangeably, not by just me, but by most people. So now if we click start, well, actually, we'll put please enter your first number right here on parse int from console, and then we'll put please enter in your second number right here. And let's go ahead and click start. So please enter in your first number. So look at all that. It's saying, hey, please enter a valid integer, because it's executing instead of a parse int from console code. So if I type in a valid integer, 88, successfully parsed integer value from your input, sick, please enter in your second number. And it's breaking. Awesome, just like we expected. And we enter 99. Successfully parsed integer value from your input. Boom, 187. So let's go ahead and 187, I assume, is the correct answer here. So let's go ahead and kind of step through this with our breakpoints and kind of see what's going on, just to make it kind of abundantly clear of what we're doing here. So let's set a breakpoint right here on console.writeLine. Let's go ahead and start, and let's get our console over here on the right side again. So let's first of all make it so we can see what's going on here. Okay, so it's going to write this line to the console. Please enter in your first number. Now we're going to go and grab our number from our parse int from console function. So if I press F11, we'll step into parse int from console here on line 25. We can see that we allocate space for a variable called num, and we set it equal to 0. And then we allocate space for a variable called parse num, which is of the type bool, and we set it equal to false initially. And then while this is false, we already kind of showed this, but it will prompt us for some input. So let's go ahead and put 90 there. And now it should be equal to true. Parse num should be equal to true. And so looks like it is. So we'll write successfully parsed integer value from your input. Boom. Awesome. So we'll break out of the loop. We'll return back to our main method up here. We'll go to our console.writeLine, and it will ask us to put in our second number there. We'll press F11 to step into our method, and we'll basically go through the exact same process. So it'll allocate space for both of these variables, and while this condition is true, we're going to try and parse our second number. So in this case, let's put something wrong there. So if we press that, we'll say, hey, parse number is equal to false. It'll write our little error message to the console, and it'll try to loop through it again. And so now we'll enter in an actual valid value. So we'll say 72. And then if parsed num is equal to false, which it shouldn't be, and it isn't, we can see down here that it's actually set to equal true. Press F10. Let's actually close these because that's getting messy. It'll write, hey, we successfully parsed your value. Awesome. We'll return back to our main function here with our num1 and num2 with the values that we got from the console. And now we'll step into our SumInt method. So if I press F11, we'll go in here. It'll show, hey, num1 is equal to 90, num2 is equal to 72, and we're going to return the result of both of these added together. So if I press F10, 10 again, we can see that my sum to num is equal to 162. And we'll write that value out to the console, and boom, that's the end of our program. Awesome. Okay, so we're basically there. That's our program. We have written a function that takes two numbers, and we've added them together, and we've returned the value, and we've written it out to the console, and we've added some error checking. We've made it pretty robust as far as, you know, the scope of this project goes. So yeah, that's our program. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask away in the comments.